means they don't want to have to put on a show, which is interesting because social media often is, but it's also why in social media things like stories, which are a little bit less filtered or curated than all the normal are gaining in popularity, are TikTok, which is another new social media app. Even though some of those things are being, you choreograph dances for those kind of things, there's still some, a little bit level of, they want to be more authentic, 10,000 miles away. And so if they arrive like in my community and they sense that we're holding back or wearing masks, they're going to be one and done every time. They want real stuff, people to share real life, and they don't want to wear masks. Diversity, again, this is the most diverse generation in U.S. history. The trajectory will be for the U.S. to be majority people of color by the year 2043, which is not that far away. Religion, first truly post-Christian generation, only 41% of them attend any sort of religious activity, not just Christian, but any sort of religious activity semi-regularly. Only 8% of them would cite a religious leader as a role model. Only 8% would cite a religious leader. Think about the issues from religious leaders, both Protestant and Catholic, things that have gone on in the world, and so most of them aren't about it. But 78% of them still believe in the existence of some sort of God, some sort of higher power or being, which is quite interesting considering not a lot of them attend religious services. So that's scratching the surface of those two generations. Lots more to nuance and add texture. And I'm sure, if this was a room full of millennials and Gen Z, people would be like, that's not me at all, or that's not me at all. But these things are at least help us wrap our heads around a little bit. So then we have, of course, the state of the church. So where is the church in all of this? Well, to be honest, not doing so well, right? We have 36%, again, of 18 to 24-year-olds describing their religion as nothing in particular. 3,500 churches shut their doors every single year. Mainline Protestantism, that's us in this room, we have experienced the greatest dip. From 2007 to 2014, we lost 5 million members in 7 years, mainline Protestants. So I'm not super interested in just sort of like us existing just to exist, right? But I am super passionate about making sure that communities like this one and like the Inclusive Collective go on into the future and are attractive to, compelling for, and find places and young adults can find places of life and meaning here. And I am because the church has been the place that, more than any other place, has been the major influence in my life. It's a place where I found community. It's a place where my gifts were named. It's the place where I found confidence. It's the place where I feel love down in my gut. It's the place that gives me fuel to change the world. More than any other place, I can't even overstate it. And so I deeply long for communities like this one to exist into the future because I think our world desperately needs it. There are so many people in our world right now who are, and I don't say this in any sort of like negative way, the lack of spaces for people to do deep work and connect to God are on the decline. And we see it, right? We see it in the way that our world is running. We see it sort of across the spectrum of political beliefs. Everybody, being so divisive, and the rhetoric is always ramping up, and people are mean-spirited, and all these things are happening. And I think a lot of it is because we're not deeply connected to ourselves and to God, and to each other. We don't sit around tables like this in a lot of places. And so I think Christianity at its best offers a powerful antidote to so much that is wrong in our world. And I want to see communities like this continue to not just survive, but to thrive, and to try to offer that to folks, and to offer this kind of space to folks. The beautiful and scary news is that God is inviting each of us, not just your pastors or me as the pastor of the Inclusive Collective. God is inviting each of us to play an active role in helping make that happen, and helping make this community and others like it a place that thrives well into the future and keeps providing space for people to do deep soul work. Death, the church is dying in a lot of ways. Let's just be honest about that. But death and resurrection is a part of the natural life cycle of the world. It is the very blueprint of our faith. Jesus moved from death to resurrection. We see it in the seasons and in the cells and the way our bodies operate. It is a natural part of how things happen. And so we may be in a little bit of a cycle of death where some things are dying, but rebirth will happen, and the church of Jesus Christ will survive. And God is inviting us to play a role in that, but I have great hope that it will, and it will be strong. And so the choice is really ours, where in this moment that's pretty critical, we can sort of bury our heads in the sand and say, well, I hope some things change, or we can make bold moves to try to lead the church into the future. And I hope, by God's grace, that we make daring, bold moves and embrace and exercise courage to follow God into what's next, into the future. I have a verse here that I love to read, and that's been really pivotal for me in my own life, and was pivotal at the restart of the Inclusive Collective. The yellow is a bit hard to read, but I'll read it for you. So don't you see, it's from Romans 8, the Message paraphrase. So don't you see that we don't owe this old do-it-yourself life one red cent? There's nothing in it for us, nothing at all. The best thing to do is to give it a decent burial and get on with your new life. God's Spirit beckons. There are things to do and places to go. This resurrection life you received from God is not a timid grave-tending life. It's adventurously expectant, greeting God with a childlike what's next? What's next? And so I think the question for us all is, how do we move from what's now to what's next? How do we move from what's now to what's next? How do we create this new life? How do we create communities that young adults are compelled to be a part of? There are perhaps a myriad of answers to that question. The Inclusive Collective has 9 core practices that we use, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them tonight because we don't have time for all of them. 3 core practices that we use to build community for young adults. Now, I also think the reality here is that a lot of these are not just about young adults, right? Is that some of you are going to hear these and be like, I want that too. And so that's purposeful and that's part of it. But the 3 practices are translating our faith, practicing an active faith, and then inviting people to the party. The first one is translating our faith. Imagine for me, or with me rather, walking into a church for the first time ever, having never attended church in your life, which is the reality for a lot of our people. My students, we did a survey at the end of last academic year. 72% of them are new or returning to the faith through the Inclusive Collective. And so that's 3/4 of them. So most of them either don't have any sort of knowledge about Christian language or have really rusty knowledge or really sort of surface level biblical literacy. And so this is the reality for a lot of this generation. So imagine going into a church, having never experienced Christian worship before, and you sit down in a service. Do you have any idea what to do, what words are being used? And it's about theological language. You hear about salvation and sanctification and sin and God's glory and grace and all these terms, and you're like, I have no idea. It feels like you walked into a place that's speaking a foreign language. Also, we use words that are difficult to talk about the church building, right? Like you have the sacristy and the narthex and all this stuff, and we can laugh about them because we all use them in different spaces. But just imagine being someone who's never experienced that before. It kind of feels like you just walked into a fraternity meeting where they're using a language that you don't understand, and it feels a little bit exclusive, right? I think the question is would you stick around if you went week after week after week and heard and was that something you couldn't understand? I had a board meeting a month ago, and one of my board members at the last minute had to Zoom in. And our technology wasn't working, and so because I didn't set it up until she last minute had to Zoom in, and so I set up a microphone, but it wasn't working well. And so about halfway through the meeting, she just texted me and said, "Hey, I'm going to log off because I can't hear anything." And I think that's the experience for a lot of our people, is that they may test things out, and then they're like, "I'm not going to come back to something I can't even understand or can't even hear." And so I think it's about using language that is accessible and compelling to people. Students in my small groups, I'll even say something like, Today we're going to look at the Gospel of Matthew. And they're like, who's Matthew and what is a gospel? Right? Or all sorts of words like that that we just take for granted that we can no longer take for granted. When I preach, I try to, one of my best friends in the world is not really a churchy person. And so I often have him read my sermons and say, what if this doesn't make sense to you? And when it doesn't make sense, I need to rework it. I think key here is it's not about dumbing things down. My students are incredibly smart, but it's about making there be access points or explain things along the way. This past year for our fall retreat, our whole theme was on sin. Not a super sexy theme. You don't really think of campus ministry retreats being on sin. But every year we actually spend the fall retreat, we try to take words that have been either misused or underused, or folks don't know what they mean, and unpack them. And so we've done sin and prayer and salvation. And so my students are really excited to go to a retreat about sin because they can't wait to learn about it and to hear about it in language that actually makes sense to them. I don't think we have to quit using all the language. I think there is power in protecting some of it, but also helping explain it and giving people on-ramps to help know what it means. This HPT FTU is a good example. I'm not going to use the language because it's bad language. But there's a British guy named Francis Spufford who's a convert to Christianity in Britain. Doesn't happen very often. If you know anything about the UK, is that their decline, some people would say 25 to 50 years ahead of the United States in terms of secularization, and so they even have less religious life than we do, and so it's a rarity for an older Brit to convert to Christianity. He converted because of the concept of sin. You don't hear that often, right? Like, I found out about sin and I just really wanted to become a Christian, but that was his experience because he says this. He said, when I learned about sin, I was like, that makes so much sense. He's like, I look around the world, I look at my own life, I look at my relationships, I watch the news, and you can just tell things are not as they should be. Things are messed up. There is a word for that, and it's sin, and the Christian language gets at that and helps define a reality that I know exists, and it not only helps define that reality, but it offers some solutions of ways forward and how to navigate it. So he calls sin the HPT FTU, the human propensity. I won't say the word, and remember this works for college students, the human propensity to F things up is what he calls it. And that's a word. My students latch onto that and stick onto that, and they're like, I don't know what sin is, but the HPT FTU. And they just get it. It just makes sense. I preached it to youth group last summer. I changed it to the HPT MTU, the human propensity to mess things up. And that's just a reality we can all know if we're honest with ourselves. And so translating our faith and finding ways to speak in ways that matter can be really important. The second practice I'll name is practicing an active faith. A question that we often use and ask ourselves in the Inclusive Collective is this first question. If our faith community suddenly ceased to exist tomorrow, would the community notice? If we suddenly shut down operation tomorrow, would anyone notice in a tangible way? And that is a hard question to ask yourself and to ask ourselves and to be honest about the answer. But it's about, are we doing things in the world that make a difference in people's lives in real tangible ways? You know, young adults may not be interested in coming to a worship service. I know a lot of mine are. They may not be interested in joining a small group. A lot of mine are. But a lot of them are very interested in the work of service and justice, and that is a part of God's grand salvation project of helping correct, justify the whole world back in line with what God wants. And so finding ways for them to get involved and have access to Christian community through the acts of service and justice are really important. These next few questions come from a book called Weird Church. And they are, the authors of Weird Church ask, what if for our metrics for how we're doing, what if we ask questions like this? How many people have decided to follow in the way of Jesus the revolutionary? How many agents of transformation do we have? How many people are making a serious attempt of investing significant personal resources of time, money, and energy in blessing their neighbors and toppling systems of oppression? That is a great metric question when we're sort of analyzing how we are building community that follows Jesus. How many of us, myself included, are making significant sacrifices, are taking up our cross and following Jesus in robust, powerful, sacrificial ways? But to practice an act of faith, we have to know what's going on in our communities, how God is already moving, what other people are doing. I really love do you know the passage from John 1? It's my favorite Christmas passage where it says, the Message version says, the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood and dwelt among us. And I find that so beautiful, is that God put on flesh, had a body, and moved into where people were working and playing and living and building families, and where there was chaos and genocide, et cetera, et cetera. So if we are going to worship Jesus, then we follow that same incarnational model as we become incarnate in our neighborhoods, and we go. This is the inclusive collective. We go where people live and work and play and study, and go there and meet people. Some of the things here is that this will require sort of knowing our community, of getting out with people who are different from us, of setting up meetings, of going and volunteering, of finding where the people already are, and what we don't have the monopoly. The church, the inclusive collective, thanks be to God, does not have the monopoly on God's work in the world. And so it's up for us to discern and to see where God is moving, and go and join in on that work and meet some people along the way, and see what we can also offer them in mutual relationship. The last thing is inviting to the there is this word that is not very popular in our mainline Christian circles, and it's called evangelism. It is kind of seen sometimes as this word that we don't want to use. We're shy about it. There's this researcher, her name is Martha Grace Reese. She did what's called the Mainline Evangelism Project, and she studied mainline churches. You know what, when I say mainline, I mean like Presbyterian, United Methodist, Lutheran. She studied mainline churches, and about their practices or lack thereof of evangelism. And she says mainline churches have this, gospel constipation. Gospel constipation. She says it because she says we have beautiful theologies of grace and love and inclusion and justice, and yet we refuse to ever share it. We're very squeamish about sharing our faith because we don't want to cause offense, or we don't want to make somebody feel bad or shamed, et cetera, et cetera. But one of my this other church planting coach named Beth Eastock tells a story about, she went to a church, and she lives in Portland, and they were asking her to consult with them, and she went there, and this person was telling her about all the good work that the church does in the community. They have a free after-school program. They had a food pantry, all these things that they were doing that were making a real tangible difference in people's lives. And the woman said, planter in Kansas used to have 10 pennies in his pocket every morning, and he wouldn't go home until he had moved every penny from his right pocket to his left pocket. The only way he moved it was by telling somebody about his church, his new church. And so every week I make my interns do just 2 of them, and they freak out about it, but I make them share their faith with 2 people per week, and then I have them report on it, who they did it with, when they did it, and what happened, to try to nurture in the capacity in them to be able to share their faith with other people. So that's one way. Another one is event-based, and so that's an easy way to sort of start that work, is being out in the community. We're on the quad all the time. We're at every single event you could ever think of where they'll let us have a table. We're doing Ashes on the Go at the train station. I'm trying to lead in public spaces, whether it's through prayer or offering some sort of word or serving on a committee or whatever it is. We're trying to get out there and have a very public face. And there's some other campus ministries at UIC that are offering a different sort of gospel to people, and they're there doing that work. And I refuse to have people think that their version of Christianity is the only version of Christianity. And so we try to be very public and very loud with our faith. And then the last thing is online, and it's about it's like I almost say these days, show a church without a robust online presence, and I'll show a church that isn't growing. And so being really creative with that kind of stuff. Think about like the digital natives piece. I'm trying to think if I bet no more than 15 to 20% of our students have come to us without looking us up online first. And so that means that 80 to 85% of our students never met me before they first looked at us on Instagram or our website, but Instagram more likely, and Facebook's even sort of like not their thing anymore. And so we try to update a really good presence and try to do things in ways that are fun and spiritual and match our sort of tone. But I think those things are really important. And not just for the church, but also for our individual. If you have social media or some sort of platform, how are we leveraging that to share our story? Do people know that we're Christian, that Jesus has done something in our lives, that we're coming to this church? Are we inviting our friends through social media to things here, etc.? If this is a community that God has used to change our lives, then we want to share that, right? Like we can't help but share it if God has transformed our lives here. So those are a few of the three of the practices that we have. What I want you to do is I want to invite you to experiment for just a moment. And we may not have time to even finish this exercise, but just for a minute. Do you want to do questions and maybe leave this for homework? Is that cool? Okay, so I'll tell you what it is, and then we'll have some homework, but I'll take some questions for the next 10 minutes or so. For homework, my mentor, Trey Hall, has this exercise. I would love for you to go home and in 25 words or less, define salvation using only secular, compelling language. So no churchy words, no words that no one. Think about a friend that you have who's never done church or doesn't do it, and then write a definition of salvation for them in 25 words or less. Can we do it? No? Okay. We can help each other. Cheating is good. Right, exactly. So, I'll take some questions now, and then you can do that at home.
So where do you meet again?
Everywhere. Where don't we meet is a better question.
So you don't have a building?
No. So when we were talking about relaunching, one of the first questions we were getting from folks is, what are you going to do for a building? And my first response was, we don't have any people. Who do we need a building for? We meet in, other departments will let us use their space. We meet in public spaces like coffee shops, so all sorts of places. We do worship at First United Methodist downtown, which is right on Washington Ave, right by the Daily Plaza. And I have a small office there where we can store some of our things. But we meet in all sorts of places. And that's really helped us to be pretty diffuse. And so, all of you were talking about like building renovations, like that. I don't have to do that. There's a downside. It could be nice to have like the Catholic Center on campus has a space that's nice and students can hang out there. So I think it could be beneficial, but we try to take advantage of it. We also are taking a note from, the fastest growing campus ministries on college campuses are evangelical campus ministries. So think if you've heard of InterVarsity, Navigators, Campus Crusade for Christ, they go by Crew now. They're all the fastest growing organizations. Guess how many of them across the country they have a building? Just about zero. And so we take notes from sort of their book and say like, okay, this is working for them. Let's try to replicate that. And so in ways that align with who we are. So yeah, we meet everywhere. And I do, one of the reasons I have an office is for more private pastoral care. I found myself last year, this is my first year to have an office. Last year I was doing premarital counseling in a coffee shop. And I was like, this is not okay. We're getting in the weeds here and there's like people everywhere. And so, so lots of places.
Why do you think there are certain churches that grow and attract so many people and then established churches are losing?
Oh my gosh, that's a big question.
But you're doing something that's unique and growing in that area.
Right.
What is it that they're doing? Is it similar to what you're doing?
Oh, I think it's some of these things, right? Like it's definitely like I really think one of the biggest things that a lot of places do is not be afraid of evangelism and be out in the community. And it's not just we're going to reiterate that it's not just about like event-based stuff. Like it's important for like Josh and Amanda to plan evangelism if you have an outreach team. But what is way more important, the reason those places grow is because people in the community share their faith with other people. And so that's where the real work is done. And that's how we've grown, right? It's like, it's not just, the event stuff is good, but the reason we've been able to grow over these past couple of years, and especially grow amongst people who weren't doing faith community before, is because I try to nurture in our students the capacity and the willingness to go and share their faith with people. And so they're sharing it. They're inviting people to things. And they're also not afraid of church. Like when they know they invite their friends to the Inclusive Collective, they know they don't have to be afraid that they're going to hear some kind of message that's, like bigotry, or they're not going to feel shamed if they come and they don't identify as Christian. We're going to have the space for them to come and be who they are and engage with us. And so I think a lot of it's evangelism. And then the translation piece is big around. And I struggle with this too. Sometimes I'll find myself using words and my students will be like, what does that mean? And so finding ways to offer and share the gospel in ways that are contextual and that matter. So like I think it's like sort of like in Park Ridge, right? And it's going to be different for me than for you all. So it's like in Park Ridge, surrounding communities, what matters to people? What are people really concerned about? What are their deepest questions? Maybe even the questions that aren't voiced out loud because they're not appropriate. Or whatnot. So like what really matters to people and trying to like speak to that, because Christianity is a deep source of wisdom and practice that meets most of our in some way all of our deepest needs. It's just been masked and misused and abused and weaponized in so many terrible ways. We have to uncover it a little bit to see it. So I think that, some of those things are really important. Yeah.
Noticed any particular most pressing concerns across the whole group?
Yeah,
Is there like a thread?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm noticing more and more and more, and it's also backed up by data. Well, I would say two things, and I think they're very related. One is utter lack of community, and so people just starving for a relationship and yet not knowing how to build it. And some of that is because of social media, right? Like I'm no Luddite, like I use social media a lot. I'm on it a lot. But I was just talking to someone about this today. Whenever my students are in a social space where they don't know what to do, they don't have to press into it. All they have to do is go on their phone and escape it. And so there's a little bit of a lacking of being able to do social relationships in a really basic way. So that's one, and even like this is a bigger issue than just young adults though. Like the UK a couple years ago created a new cabinet level position, so like the equivalent of our like Secretary of Defense, called the Minister of Loneliness, because loneliness is becoming a public health concern. And some people say, there's been some studies done from doctors and researchers, that loneliness can have a worse effect on a person's health than smoking. And so that's a big deal. So I think loneliness. I watch people at UIC go around not having a single friend. And I just think, oh, my college days were my best friendships were formed. So that's sad. The other thing that's related to loneliness is mental health concerns. And I would bet they're also high in Park Ridge for different reasons perhaps. But the UIC Counseling Center has seen a 5-fold increase in the last 5 years. And they're hiring counselors left and right, can't keep up with the demand. I asked the head counselor, I said, is it because it's less taboo and more people are going? Or is it because there's more mental health concerns? And he said both. He said there's some good around it. The more people are going and not feeling ashamed. I go to therapy every single week of my life. I love it, so I'm really open with that. And I say that to try to create space for it, because there's still shame in a lot of our communities. And so I think that that's part of it. People are feeling less shame, but also people are just sort of riddled with particularly anxiety and depression. Anxiety being probably the highest thing that I see is students. It's not rare for a panic attack to happen on a retreat of ours. I think just about every retreat, there's some form of panic attack that happens. So I've gone to, seminary doesn't really teach you about that. So I've gone to mental health first aid trainings and things to try to help me get some knowledge about that. Yeah, so those things. Yeah.
I noticed on the first pictures that there were little children there. Do you deal with families?
Little children, let's see.
There are little children in there?
There's some like artwork of kids in the bottom corner one.
Let's see. Sure. Oh, that's artwork. Yeah. We don't. Most of our people are 18 to 25. That's just artwork that's one of my students. In the far right, you can see Caleb, but he's standing by some artwork.
Yeah, I didn't know
Yeah.
if they
Yeah, totally.
people had more families.
Right. No, we do have at least one student who has just one who has a child. We don't do. One of our big things is we try to have a laser-like focus. And so our laser-like focus is this age range, 18 and 25, mostly undergraduate and graduate students, a few young professionals, and then also programmatically, we go after that soul work piece. We don't try to be all things to all people and do a million different things. We're creating space for people to encounter God in a few different ways, and that's our job. And so we don't do stuff for children. The one thing we do is sometimes we interact with youth groups. It's been really positive. We talked about this before. Is we have at our dinner party with people experiencing homelessness, we will often have youth groups from the surrounding areas, the city and the suburbs, come visit. And one of the cool things I think about it is oftentimes students in youth group don't see the next age group in church. So they may see, like them, and they see like 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds. And so they don't see that faith doesn't stop with the end of youth group. And in fact, it can be a really vibrant part of your college experience. And so we try to model that. And so like my students do all the programming for them. So they come and they do this volunteer opportunity, and they also see, 20-year-olds leading them in faith community and sort of faith life. So that's the only time we really, and most of that's like 7th through 12th graders. Yeah.
Do you find you have people coming in that need a sense of community that have maybe had a negative experience growing up with religion or another, and that so makes it harder for them to even come in your door?
Yeah, totally. The question about, sorry, I should have been saying the questions for, I think we have online. So the question about, do we have people who come in our community with a lot of baggage around Christianity? And the answer is a resounding yes. I don't even know if there's one person. No, that's not true. We have a few people, very few, who come from churches like this one, in fact, and I don't just say this because I'm here, but churches like this one who didn't grow up with a version of Christianity that was sort of anti-everything. And so those are my students who are like ready to go from day one, and they don't have the trauma, which is a real gift to me because they're just ready to do ministry and not have to sift through all this stuff. So we have a few of those folks, but most of our people, in some way or another, come with spiritual trauma. And spiritual trauma is a very deep form of trauma. If you think about it, that our spiritual lives reside at the deepest places of ourselves, right, at a sort of gut level, knowing and interaction and experience. And so when we have spiritual wounds, then, they are not surface level wounds, but they are deep wounds. There's a whole, like, psychologists have a whole sort of area of study about this, about spiritual trauma. So we get those folks a lot. But, they come, a lot of them will say things like, particularly our graduate students, maybe in undergrad, they would have said, you know what, I don't need God. If God doesn't want me, then I don't want to be about God. I don't need church. They really screwed me up, whatever it is. And they'll get to graduate school and they'll think, gosh, I thought that the intellect was going to be the place where I was sort of saved. Like my life was going to be so bound up in knowledge and be getting a PhD or whatever it is. And then I discovered that there's more to life than the intellectual pursuit. And there's more to life than academia. And also academia is kind of failing, drowning in it. And I need something to help buoy me in the midst of this. And then they'll sort of come to us. They'll find us, we'll find them. And they'll be like, they'll also often enter very cautiously. And not for bad reason, for a very good reason. And we work hard to win their trust. And we do, usually. There's very few people who because we're just honest about who we are. We're honest about, sometimes people want to come in and say, is this like an interfaith group? And I gently say, no, it's not. We do interfaith work. I love my friends of other faiths. This is a Christian group, and so we are rooted in Christianity. I want the Muslim Student Association to be rooted in Islam, not in Christianity, because they're not Christian. And so that's kind of how we operate. It's just having real honesty, and also telling them that we're going to mess up. We're going to do things that something happens, but also developing people to have the grace to be able to, and the capacity to be able to withstand those things. So yeah, almost everybody has spiritual trauma. Yeah. I mean,
So your students that you've launched from the Inclusive Collective graduated
yeah.
and they're grown-ups in the world.
Mhm.
Do they find themselves in faith communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the interesting things about the Inclusive Collective is that because we also have graduate students, a lot of our folks would still call us their main faith community, even if the few people who have graduated. Also remember that this is only our 5th year to be on campus, so we don't have a lot of, we didn't start with a lot of, we don't have a lot of people yet to have a test case for that. But we have, I would say, sort of 3 people who have moved, I can think of in my head, because I just thought about this for Ryan Wallace the other day. We have 3 people who have either moved cities or have sort of like, they were involved in Inclusive Collective as undergrads and viewed it as like an undergrad thing. And of those 3, 2 are. So one is not, he's sort of like finding his way, but 2 of them are. One is in Boston, and his first question to me when he was moving is, what are church recommendations? And he got immediately involved and helps lead their young adult program at a Methodist church in Boston. The other one stayed in Chicago, same question, and he helps lead a sort of like diversity, working on racial diversity team at his church in the city. And so one of them, again, is kind of finding his way. 2 of them have immediately stepped into leadership. My deep hope, and one of the things we're trying to track is this, which is why I was talking to Ryan about it. You all know Ryan Wallace, right, some of you? Ryan's on the board of the Inclusive Collective. So my deep hope is that we are, that whenever, in fact, I view it as a little bit of a failure on myself. I think I've said this to you before. People, if the majority of our folks don't be involved in faith community afterwards. Because I don't want them to see the Inclusive Collective as this one-time cool thing they did when they were undergraduate, graduate students. I want it to launch them into a lifetime of encounters with God, of doing the work of God in the world. I want them to arrive here and for like you guys to be like, I'm so glad that Stephen Schraz is here and is ready to lead. I want to nurture that capacity in them so that when they get here, they're not causing problems. They're not just going to brunch on Sundays. They're coming to worship and ready to lead from day one. So that's one of our deep hopes. That's another way we hope to be a partner, a mutual partner, rather than just someone who's taking money. Is we want to raise up sort of next generation of faith leaders, the people who will be leading in churches like this one across the country.
It asks the hard question of us then, of like, what kind of church do they find? So that's
Right.
not a question for Rich, but like, what do they think when they walk in?
Right, yeah, totally.
Have we been doing soul work? Have we
Right.
been
Right.
doing this?
Yeah, totally. Right. Because they do have high expectations for a lot of reasons. And also, yeah, we try to build them with a capacity to like come and affect change and be leaders. But also they want to arrive to something where they feel, one of the biggest things that I see, and this is one of our other practices, we call it different things sometimes, but I think our current iteration, we call it like keep it real. And it's about, we want to be a community where people feel the Holy Spirit in active, vibrant ways. I want people, when they come to our worship services, to feel like they just had an experience that's going to change their life in some way. And I get we can't do that every time. Not everyone's going to have that every time. But part of that is that I really want to believe what I say when I'm preaching, when I'm doing things. And God has done a good thing in me, and I want to share about it. And Parker Palmer, any Parker Palmer fans? He's a Quaker author. He's an amazing author. I recommend him all the time. He did a study, or talks about a study in one of his books that was done at a university. And they basically they were trying to find what made students like a class. And they tested for, was it they got a good grade? No. They tested for, was it because they had an affinity for the subject? You like math class the best. No. You know what the number one thing that helped correlate with if a student liked a class? is if they believed that the professor really loved and cared about and believed in what they were teaching. And I just think that's so true, is my students have zero interest in sort of like surface level Christianity. They want the real stuff. And so they may operate with a more, this is one of the things where like I often don't scoff at like evangelical churches, because I may believe some different things in them, but there's power, something's happening. There's a power there that I think we should pay attention to. And we could use a little bit of a double dose of it in the mainline church, some excitement and passion and energy about our faith. And so my students, they may hold, a progressive theology in a lot of ways, but they're going to be deeply passionate about it, and they're going to want to be with people who are deeply passionate. So I think that's one of the main things, is like becoming passionate. Yeah, Josh.
Karen wants to know, are you familiar with John Pavlovich's writings, for example, A Bigger Table?
Yes, I am. I have not, a confession. What was that? Oh, hi, Karen. Hi, Karen. I have not read his whole books, but he has a great blog and a pretty robust Twitter presence. And so, is anyone else familiar with John Pavlovich? Okay, he's a great writer. So if you can go Google him online, and he has a great blog post. But no, I haven't read his full book. What's it called? Build a Bigger Table?
A bigger table.
A Bigger Table. Yes, I haven't read it, but I hear good things. Question from a viewer. This is the first time that's ever happened to me. Facebook Live or YouTube Live, and questions coming in. I love it.
So think about our traditional church service, looking at it from a young person, your age group. What are the things that when they walk in and they're seeing in our structure that are turning them off? What is it from our?
Well, I haven't been to worship here, so I don't.
Or traditional, think of a traditional Presbyterian church.
Sure.
They follow similar formats.
Yeah.
What is it that, they're reading in the bulletin or that like sends up?
Yeah. So I'll tell you some things. These are some like basic things that I see. Is like one is it doesn't matter if it's traditional or contemporary. Like we talked about this a little bit today. It's like, is it done well, and not perfect and not overly polished, but like has there been thought and intention put into the service? I think is important. Is it like you're talking about? What do they look at in the bulletin? Is it poorly designed? This generation, like my students, have zero tolerance for poor design, and I know it sounds shallow, but it's very real. And so, like, if they open a bulletin, I go to churches to preach sometimes, and I'm like, I can't even read it. It's so bad, and the font's so bad, and all the design's so terrible. And I think that really turns them off. Like, we pride ourselves in the Inclusive Collective on having really good design because it matters to people. And visual images also sort of evoke things in us, too. And so is it visually rich? I think some of it is about, like, when they walk in, does it feel like stodgy, or like they have to like tiptoe around, or are they walking with like coffee and then it's like, oh, well, you can't bring your coffee in the sanctuary because of this thing or that thing or whatever. It's like, just let people come in. I think this is something I see a lot, and it's like when my friends go to church in other places where they're the youngest person, is there's a difference between being being welcomed warmly versus being like attacked. So it's like, oh my gosh, you're the first young person we've seen in the last 10 years. Can you be on every committee in this entire church? And they're like, no, I just wanted to get like a bagel and go to worship. And so I think that's something. So yeah, those are a few other things that I would say. I would also say, is it infused with meaning? So I think that I sometimes preach at churches, and just honestly in Chicagoland, Methodist or Presbyterian churches, and I will think, while I'm in worship, I'm just being very real with y'all, and of everyone who ever watched this on YouTube, evidently, is that I will think, why are people here? Because the liturgy will be so stale. And it's, again, this is not about traditional worship or contemporary worship. It's not about that war, like, I'm so over that. It is about, like, have the people been doing the same thing for like 40 years, and the language hasn't changed. We're using words that no one knows. and doing rituals that no one knows. It's simple stuff, right? It's like I think about things like every time that I do communion with the Inclusive Collective, I just give a simple explanation of what communion is. And I'll say something like, this past Friday I said, in the Inclusive Collective, we talk a lot about doing church in experimental and new and innovative ways. And that's great. But some things we do are just plain old. And this is one of them. Tonight, we're going to take communion as we do every time we gather for worship. Communion is a practice, if you didn't know, that Jesus instituted himself. And one of the reasons we do this practice is because we want to be as close to Jesus as we can. And this is one of the things we know that Jesus instituted because we read about it in the scriptures. Jesus was sitting at a table, then I'll say, in this practice, we believe that in some very weird and also some very mysterious way, that Jesus meets us right here. And we don't know how to explain it fully, but it's true and it feels real if you'll give it a shot. And then I'll go into the liturgy about Jesus was sitting at a table with his closest friends, eating dinner just like what we ate. And Jesus knew that he was getting ready to die, and then I'll go through the liturgy and stuff, and we sort of word it to people that it connects to them. But just doing stuff like that, or, if I use the word sin in a sermon, using the HPTFTU that I named earlier, or saying sin is, we're meant to love God and love our neighbor and love creation and love ourselves. And sin is when we move away from love of God and neighbor and creation and self. And so just little things that help define things and infuse them with meaning, I think can be helpful. Yeah. Great. All right. Thank you so much. This is great. And thanks for your good questions. I appreciate it. Thanks, Karen. Awesome. Thanks, friends. And I'll be around.